Hello, everyone. My name is Kyla Hannington, and I am the Public Outreach and Engagement Division Manager with the Prince George's County Office of Human Rights, the county's civil and human rights education and enforcement agency. Our office investigates complaints of discrimination, combats human trafficking around the region, ensures equitable language access to county government services to all people in the language of their preference, and provides opportunities for engagement and learning about social justice and civil rights issues. I am really happy to welcome you all to the launch of our new series with the University of Maryland and the Prince George's County Memorial Library System, Social Justice in Community. How does human rights research impact our communities? How does scholarship on human rights violations or issues of social justice have any meaning in our day-to-day lives? And what is being discussed, studied, and thought about in universities today? This series brings human rights scholars into conversation about how their work illuminates human rights struggles around us today and what we can do about those struggles. Featuring different scholars from the University of Maryland across a variety of disciplines, from African American studies to sociology to criminology and criminal justice to economics to government and politics to anthropology to hearing and speech sciences and more. This series brings exciting new voices to the Prince George's County community and offers us all fresh ways to engage. I do want to take a moment and give particular thanks to Dr. Chris Marsh at the University of Maryland. Dr. Marsh has been a frequent guest of ours and does an incredible amount of work around Prince George's County and the region, from facilitating community conversations to being the person who conceptualized this series. We are grateful to her for her ongoing partnership with the Office of Human Rights to bringing social justice and community to us, and for all of her other many contributions to our collective community. Today, for our very first of this series, it's going to run from today through the beginning of May, we welcome Amber Colquhoun, presenting Through Their Eyes, examining affluent Black intra-group attitudes and their political consequences. Ms. Colquhoun is a PhD student studying American politics. Her research interests include race and ethnic politics, political behavior, and public opinion. She received her BA with honors in African American Studies and Psychology. Amber, thank you very much for being here as our official inaugural guest. It's great to have you.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much, Kyla, for that intro. Thank you again for Dr. Chris Marsh for having me do this. I'm so grateful for this chance. I'm just going to talk a little bit about me and my research and what I do. I really want this to be a conversation, so please feel free. If there's any questions on what I'm saying, I would be happy to clarify. So basically, I'm Amber. Like Kyla said, I am a politics second-year PhD student. Something really important about me and something that informs my work is I was born and raised in Brooklyn, right? I grew up very middle class, so my interests are very much so in class, Black politics. I study behavior as well as attitudes. Those are some of the basic research topics, right, that I look at. My research right now focuses on how middle and upper class Black people view or perceive low-income Black folks, right? And that's more generally perceived. And what that means for policy support, locally, for things like crime and for things like welfare. Within political science, we do know so much about how white folks view Black people, but my work really wants to take an intragroup lens, because I feel like those class and gendered lines really matter if we look within a group. And so my perspective really looks at if racism is really as powerful as we think it is. If we were to take that logic, it's able to impact those that it actually sort of marginalizes, right? And so within that logic, what I'm saying is that I believe that it's possible for more privileged subgroups of Black folks. And what I mean when I say more privileged subgroups, I sort of describe that to mean middle and upper class Black people, as well as men, as well as non-queer folks, to sort of inadvertently work to like internalize these negative attitudes when it comes to low-income Blackness, right? And so my work sort of looks at do middle and upper class Black people hold perceptions of laziness? Do they hold perceptions of, sort of criminality when it comes to low income Black people? And what are the policy ramifications for such? And so I think that this is a big conversation when we look outside of the academic realm. If we were to just look at Black folks within the community, I think that there's a lot of negative stereotypes when it comes to low-income Black people. And that rhetoric often shows up in conversations when we look at class lines, gendered lines, but it's not so much brought into the academic realm. And so why does this really matter? Why does my work matter? I think that it sheds light on the perceptions of low-income Black people from members of their own in-group. How might these negative attitudes influence policy, I think is really important. I'm not trying to say through my research at all that these are the same ramifications in which racism impacts white people. I think that these are very much so, we could think about these ideas as very much so to be Black people as actors sort of enacting a top-down sort of phenomena. And so I don't think that it's the responsibility necessarily of middle class and upper class Black people and their views of negative or in having these negative attitudes about low income Black people. I just think it's due to racism's just its sort of like powerfulness and its pervasiveness and even impacting the people that it marginalizes. And so just a little bit about my methods. It's very quantitative based. Put in simple terms, I use a lot of surveys. Yeah, I'm trying to think what else I can say about my work for right now. That's really it in terms of a brief overview. I think I would just go with questions and then we can go from there about what this work maybe means, what other topics y'all think might play into this, and things of that nature. But for right now, that's the brief overview. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Thank you very much. I do have questions
Yeah, thank you so
already.
much. Yeah, please.
So I was interested, and I want to, please understand, and this is for viewers too, that any mistake in the question is definitely my own, just misunderstanding.
No, you're fine.
So one of the things I understand, like I believe I understand, is what you're looking at is really, in what ways are privileged. And I like, you did a nice identification of what you're using as criteria for what it means to be privileged. People in the Black community, in what ways are they enacting this top-down focus on other members of the Black community, right?
Right.
And one of the things that you talked about is looking at the pervasiveness of racism and that how that these negative tropes can be, exist in the in-group. And I'm wondering, is there a way, or are you seeing ways in which, like, or how does one separate what maybe racist attitudes and what may be classist attitudes, or do you find that those are symmetrical?
Yeah, so that's a great question, Kyla. I'm going to be writing down questions as y'all ask them. But so I'm really interested in looking at sort of the interaction between race and class. And so within the conception that I have of low-income Blackness, I don't think that the two could be separated because we're looking at an in-group lens. I do think that these are both racialized and classed tropes. Being that these are members of their own racial group, I think that a lot of the sort of justification falls on class, right? And it falls on the shortcomings of being low income. And so with that, I think a lot of the justification comes in, oh, well, maybe they don't work hard enough. Or maybe if they were able to sort of pick themselves up by the bootstraps, they would have, jobs that would pay more, things of that nature. And so while I do think that there's very much so a dual nature between the two, you can't necessarily separate it, but the justification that I think might be used is more class versus race, if that makes sense.
So I'm going to try and paraphrase what I think is happening.
No, please.
So what you're seeing, it seems like what you're seeing in your research is that really the layer of racism, you can't, like, racism is there. This internalized anti-Black, anti-low-income Black is present, and that there may be people who try to act like it's just about class, but it's not. It's not. You can't separate those racist ideologies. Is that correct?
Yes, exactly. Especially when you think about low income blackness, or if you think about perceptions of welfare, if you think about perceptions of laziness, or even sort of like criminality, those are all tied not only to being low income, but to being black, right? And so there's been literature within political science, within sociology, that shows that the two cannot be separated, right? I'm really big right now within my research at looking at what this means for policy, for sort of support on not only crime policies, but welfare policies. And so if we think about welfare and the perceptions of welfare being very much so dependent on low income blackness, they just can't really be separated, right? If you think about tropes like the welfare queen, that's a low income black woman, right? And so that trope is very much so dependent on her not only being low income, her not only being a woman, but her being black. And so I think that, yeah, and so I think that ideas of blackness, even within the black community, has been sort of tied to class, and that being specifically low income. And so when middle and upper class black people are middle and upper class, especially if they didn't come from that, it sort of places blackness within this sort of weird juxtaposition, right? Where you're not what's averagely defined as black. And so how does that work, right?
And so what are you finding? Like, well, actually, I have a lot of questions. Let me try and stay focused.
Please.
Okay.
Thank
so
you.
One of the things that I have is, let's put a pin in what are you finding, like, but I want to go back to how are you, you talked about doing like how you're doing the research. So are you doing surveys, or how are you finding people to connect with? Can you take us through that?
Sure, yeah. So I just ran my first experiment. It was through Qualtrics, which is a survey platform. And basically, what I do is I pay for a sample of folks, right? So my sample is about 556 Black people. I then oversample middle and upper class Black people. I define that specifically as folks with a family median income of 75K or over. And so what I do is I'm trying to activate these negative attitudes about low income Black people, right? And so I'm saying, and I place this within the context of like local housing acts and local housing welfare acts. And so specifically when you think about gentrification, right, that's an instance where middle and upper class Black people have to face issues that low income Black people are going through, right? So what I mean by that specifically is I give Black people a scenario in which I'm like, hey, there is a local government subsidized housing complex being moved into your area, right? This is for low income Black people that have been displaced, right? And this is all due to gentrification. Specifically, we can see this happening in DC, right? We can see Southeast DC very much so being gentrified, right? At the same time, members in PG County, there seems to be this weird Black flight that's happening out of PG County to Howard County, which is farther. Some of the synopsis behind my work is saying that the Black flight out of PG County and the gentrification of Southeast, or the, so, yeah, right. So the gentrification of Southeast and the Black flight out of PG County, they're correlated. And my reasoning behind that is that there's a very much so distance that middle and upper class Black folk want to keep between themselves and low income Black people, due to financial status, and due to goals of that nature, but also due to like keeping that sociological distance, just between themselves and Black people. And so that's the framework that I use for my methods. And so basically I'm telling Black people, right, there's a local government subsidized housing complex that is being built inside of your area. Do you support this, right? And then I use research shows that the presence of a local government's like housing complex could impact your housing value, right? And so a lot of the story beforehand seemed to be that this was economic self-interest, right? That Black people didn't necessarily hold these negative attitudes. It was just they were concerned about their housing value and about their financial status. with the sort of influx of low-income Black people. But what I found was that middle and upper class Black people were not as opposed to low-income Black people moving in as I thought they were. The policy support was pretty high for that. But what I did find was that they feared for their safety, right? So they did sort of support these policies when it came to local housing welfare, but they openly reported that with the influx of low-income Black people, they feared more for their safety as compared to the white condition and to the control condition. And so that sort of launched this new line of research, not new, but I would say refined line of research that really is trying to tune into, okay, I really think that middle and upper class Black people, if you activate these attitudes, they have these subconscious negative attitudes, I think tied to criminality and fear. And if those were to be activated, I think that if you were to look in the crime policy domain, you can see sort of dissonances in support when it comes to middle and upper class Black people.
Okay, well, so first of all, I just want to explain, if you hear me typing, I'm taking notes so I can ask you questions.
Oh,
I
you're
realized
fine.
I said that before we started.
I appreciate it. Yeah.
We actually have a lot of questions from viewers, though. So before I just keep hogging all the question time, let me share a couple things. First of all, we do have questions here from YouTube, from Lemon Springs Girl, who's wondering, are your surveys nationwide or are they relegated to certain regions?
Yeah, no, so that's a great question. So my surveys are nationwide. I'm trying to make my findings sort of as generalizable as possible. So yes, I do have folks from all over the nation taking these surveys.
Okay, and then we have another one, which is from another viewer who said, did anything surprise you about your findings?
Yeah, so right now, like I was saying before, I think it was really interesting that when we're looking at local housing welfare policies, right, in the scenario that I gave middle and upper class Black people, and okay, do you support low income Black people moving into your area? There was an overwhelming just policy support for that, which I thought on its face made sense when you think about literature. But at the same time, I think that the scenario would have posed more sort of conservative leaning sort of policy preferences on that. What I did find to be super surprising, though, was the feelings about safety, right? Like middle and upper class Black people very much so reported feeling unsafe if these low income Black people were to move into their area. And so that made me think, okay, maybe if I'm not looking so much at housing welfare policies, but crime, I think is really important to maybe look at. It seems very much so like there's this fear of low income Black people, which we see a lot, right? If we look at literature on how white folks perceive Black people, there's this idea of being criminal. And so the question, though, hasn't been asked, are middle and upper class Black people able to sort of internalize those same tropes and those same ideas? And how does that function in a political way, right? And so just to sum all that up, I think I found those negative attitudes when it comes to safety. I'm just trying to figure out the policy ramifications for such. Doesn't seem like it's playing out as much as I thought when it comes to housing welfare policies. And so I'm trying to take a look at crime now. I'm trying to do an IAT test maybe to look at those very much so like subconscious attitudes that middle and upper class Black people might not even write down on a survey.
So about that, you had said something when you were speaking previously, and that was what I was typing. I was trying to get down the quote, and I didn't get the whole quote, so I apologize for the kind of blank spots.
You're okay, don't apologize.
You talked about like upper and middle class Black folks fearing for their safety as compared to white or the control group.
Yeah.
So can you clarify, did you do a study with, tell us about that. Like, what were these controls that you did, and who were you looking at, and what were those findings?
Sure. Yeah. So essentially, my survey looked at. So it gave the scenario that I was saying that, hey, these are sort of low income tenants that are moving into your area. This is a sort of government subsidized housing complex that are being put into your area. But in order to sort of compare how Black folks felt about sort of low-income Black tenants moving in, I had to have some sort of like just something to sort of compare it to, right? And so in one treatment, I put that these are low-income white people moving in, and then the other, I did not describe a race. I just said that these are low-income tenants moving in, right? And so some Black people are seeing these are low-income Black people that are moving in. There's an equal part of the sample that's then seeing that these are low-income white people moving in, and then there's a third that's then getting the control, which has no race mention and just says that these are low-income people moving into the area. And so then what I was able to see, right, is if we were to compare those three treatments, what do we see? And what I saw was that low-income Black people in that treatment that had the most policy support for this housing welfare policy that I had described. But it also had, for safety, this was a condition in which middle and upper class Black people feared the most for their safety as compared to the low-income white tenant condition and compared to the control. And so that was really interesting.
Okay. Yeah. So really that you're seeing the survey showed support for the policy, support for the idea, but particularly for support for low-income housing for Black folks, right? That was particularly supported from a policy perspective, but on how this might affect me personally, I feel a greater degree of fear if I'm a survey. That's what the survey was showing. Is that am I understanding that correctly? Okay, wow.
Exactly.
There's one. Again, there's still questions from viewers, but I just want to again something you just said. You mentioned an IET test. What is that?
Yeah, so an IAT test.
IAT.
Yeah. So it sort of tests your subconscious ideas of a race, right? And so I think it was employed at Harvard through the psychology program at first. You might have taken this at your local high school or even college if you've taken
the unconscious bias test.
Exactly. Yeah. But what hasn't been done is testing this on Black people to other Black people and taking into consideration class lines, right? So what I want to do is show middle and upper class Black people pictures of low-income Black people, or tell them that they're low income, and then compare that to pictures of other middle class and upper class Black people, or even compare that to pictures of white people and see if there's this sort of unconscious bias at play. Because some of these things I don't think are the most reportable. I think it's very socially undesirable to say, from a Black person's point of view, I think it would break racial group norms to say, oh yeah, I do have these attitudes that maybe aren't the best towards low-income Black people. I am sort of scared of them. Like, that's crazy to say out loud. And I don't always think that these are conscious ideas. So I think that getting at an IAT test might be a good way to go about that.
Well, that leads us to another question that we have from a viewer, and I'm just going to share it. I got it outside of the YouTube chat, so I'm just going to share it in there so I can put it up on the screen. This is from a viewer who says, racism versus classism, which concept do you think is the hardest for people to change their views, behaviors, or even acknowledge their biases? And I know that segued nicely with what you were just saying about maybe speaking out loud some biases.
Yeah. Which concept do you think is the hardest for people to change their views, behavior, acknowledge their biases? That's a really good question. I think that I'm going to speak in terms of Black people specifically, since that's what I study. I'm not very familiar with like other marginalized communities, so I don't want to speak on behalf of that without knowing for sure. And this is still just speculation. But I would say, and I would not call this, I wouldn't say that middle and upper class Black people are racist. That's not what I'm saying at all. I would think that there's maybe some like internalized racial bias or maybe some prejudice at play. But I think if we look from a marginalized perspective, it's really hard to come to terms with you having these negative racialized ideas of people within your racial group. That's really hard to come to terms with. And I think that could be really tricky to look at. I don't know how I would have a conversation with a middle or upper class Black person that held these views and been like, your ideas or your negative attitudes are not only sort of dependent on the person being low income, but also Black, right? Like these ideas are very much so more salient if we were to look at a low income Black person versus a low income white person. And so I think it's harder to break down racism's tropes and how it impacts marginalized communities. I think classism is also a touchy topic for middle and upper class Black people, but I think that makes more sense, right? Yeah, but I think you can't have one without the other, right? You can't have racism without classism, really. So they really go hand in hand. But that's something I'm trying to figure out now too in my research, is what would I call these, right? Like, are these racialized and classed attitudes? Are these just classed attitudes? Like, where does this fall in? So that's definitely something that I'm trying to sparse out within my own work right now.
Well, so this is great. So thank you so much.
Thank you guys.
I have another question from a viewer who says, does geography impact your results? Are you seeing variations corresponding to regions of the country or rural or urban areas?
Yeah, that's a really great point. So I have to look into region more within my data. I did ask for the zip codes just to see if I were to control for region, which basically means if I were to sort of consider that when I'm looking at the data, whether I would still see like a relationship there. I'm not sure as of now. My theory behind it, mind you, this research has went through so many changes and growth through the year and a half that I've been a PhD student. But what I really wanted to look at first was Black people living in the suburbs. I thought that was really interesting. I thought that middle and upper class Black people within those regions, I thought that some of them, there was a reason why they were moving to the suburbs, right? Like I said before, I thought that distance was really important, especially if we were to look at PG County versus Southeast DC. Why is it that some middle and upper class Black people don't choose to live in DC but choose to live on the outskirts? So I thought that was really important. I would think in the suburbs that might be a more pronounced sort of phenomena. Within political science, though, it's very much so about trying to make your results as general as possible, which I think can be somewhat of a downfall. And so some of these differences that you guys bring up, which are great, I think sometimes gets overlooked. So I'll be sure to look into regional differences.
And then we have one of our longtime viewers, good friends of the library and to our office, Ms. Vivian, who's wondering, why did you start this research? What brought you to this?
That's a really good question. There was multiple things. Like I said before, I'm from Brooklyn. I grew up lower middle class to middle class. My dad was a teacher, and then with time, we went up the middle class ranking. And so I think to hear his idea, and then at the same time, right, like Brooklyn was very much so becoming gentrified. My dad owned a house. And so I heard his perceptions of low-income Black people moving into the area and how that would lessen his property value and what that would do to his finances. And so I thought my dad was super interesting, nor did I think he was an outlier. And so when I first started this research, it was very much so about economic self-interest, right? It was very much so about middle and upper class Black people feel this way about low-income Black people because they want to protect their economic self-interest, right? They're going to have these conservative leaning policy preferences when it comes to local housing welfare policies due to not wanting to lessen their property value, which is the same thing that I would hear my dad say, right? That's not the overall story. And so I then sort of turned to what's happening in DC right now, right? With the sort of gentrification of Southeast and this weird Black flight we're seeing out of PG County. They're moving to Howard County. This is happening in cities everywhere. We could see this in Brooklyn, like I was saying. We can see this on the West Coast. And so I thought that Black flight, I think it has something to do with economic self-interest. But I also think, like I was saying, there's this distance that I'm trying to understand. I also think, I don't know, when you are middle and upper class, as a Black person, I think that you're perceived a different way. And I think that could be internalized, right? I think especially in professions where, you know, you might be a Black person that is making over a certain amount of money, you're not viewed as a prototypical Black person. And so if you're viewed differently, how do those perceptions then shape how you view low-income Black people, right? Let's take a Black doctor. I think that there are certain ways in which white people view them as an outlier of the group. Over time, through that socialization and through that praise, does that then impact how they view low-income Black people, especially when we think about things like work ethic? If we think about things like, oh, well, I was able to do it, why can't you? That sort of nature, I think, is really interesting to think about. And so I think about like the socialization of class, right? If a Black person was able to work their way up, how do they then view people that are not on their sort of socioeconomic level? So there's multiple things that played into my story. I'm very much so still trying to figure it out. But partially being from Brooklyn, partially seeing what's going on in DC right now with this Black flight, and then also just seeing how middle and upper class Black people sort of maneuver through the world. Yeah.
So I have a question, because you've mentioned something a couple times, and I just want to make sure that I'm clear, which is you're talking about the gentrification of Southeast DC.
Yeah.
And that you see a correlation between that and Black flight out of Prince George's County.
That's what I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes. Can you tell? So tell me about that, because you know, gentrification. How is gentrification of DC causing, or in your understanding, what you're seeing, how are you seeing a link between that and wealthy Black folks leaving Prince George's County?
Yeah, no, thank you. That's a great question. I think this goes back into what I was saying a little bit before about how I thought this was a story of economic self-interest, but I think there's more to that. So basically in Southeast DC, and I'm not from DC, so please clarify for me if I'm wrong or if you guys think something else is happening. So Southeast DC, the way that I'm picturing it is that due to gentrification, right? Native folks that were born and raised in Southeast DC, or just low-income Black people that have found themselves living in Southeast DC, are being pushed out of the area, right? They're not going into Northeast DC. They're not going into Northwest DC, because those are very affluent areas. But instead, they're going on the outskirts of those metropolitan areas, right? So they're going outside of DC, closer to places like PG County, right? Which is on average 8 miles from DC, right? And then they're also going to places like Montgomery County as well, which is a bit closer, maybe like Silver Spring area. But gentrification, and this is not just in DC, just the way gentrification works generally, is when people are pushed out of these city areas, they go on the outskirts usually, right? And so my thinking is that when these low-income Black people move closer to these middle and upper class Black people that are in PG County, it should also be said that in PG County, there's Bowie, which was the wealthiest predominant Black suburb in the nation until 2020, I want to say. And so these are very much so middle and upper class Black folks that are in PG County. And so when low-income Black folks are moving closer to PG County, that then decreases the property value of folks in PG County, right? Because low-income Black people are moving closer to their area. And so what I thought was happening then, right? And then at the same time, you see this weird Black flight where middle and upper class Black people are moving out of PG County to Howard County, which is even farther from DC. I think, I forget on average how many miles it is away from DC, but it's farther than 8 miles, right? This is talked about on the Washington Post. It's talked about on the Atlantic. It's talked about on Brookings. All of these sites are talking about this odd Black flight and trying to explain why this is happening. And so I thought that the two were related, that middle and upper class Black people were moving away due to low-income Black people moving closer to them and the impact that was having on their property values. So again, this started off as a story of economic self-interest. But like I was saying, that's not what I found with policy support levels on local housing welfare policies. And so I'm thinking there's something might be different at play that's moving these middle and upper class Black suburbanites away from PG County to Howard County and places like that, and Charles County.
Yeah, it's really interesting to me, like what you're seeing in terms of policy support, because I think
Yeah,
this is one of the things, like when, and also with this series, we're thinking, okay, so what's happening? What are people studying, and what's the impact, and how's that impacting us, here in our communities? And
yeah,
so I'm really curious about, this strong, you've got, it seems to me, and I know we talked about this, but you've got strong policy support. So our voting action, our support of politicians, what we want to see, we're acting, it seems like, as you're describing this, you're talking about upper middle class Black folks acting for the good of really acting for the good of the whole,
right.
acting in a public policy way very positively, but holding, maybe quietly, that only comes out in your survey, a concern. Is that
Exactly.
these
Exactly.
attitudes that you've maybe that you're seeing in your survey, these are not being, we're not seeing these um you're seeing the opposite in terms of policy, or in terms of
Exactly.
power decision making. So what do you make of that?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really great point. That's a huge thing within Black politics. It's this idea of linked fate, which is really just a fancy way of saying that Black people make policy decisions for the good of the racial group, right? We have done that historically. We still do that. My question, though, is when does that break down? And so
Mhm.
I think it's really interesting to look at, oh yeah, middle and upper class Black people, if they were to report their answers on policy support, they very much so um, have support for these policies, but their private attitudes about low income Black people are like, if I have to be honest, I'm still worried about my safety more than if any other group were to move in. And so I think that has really big ramifications if we think about public perceptions of low income Black people. I think that really speaks to these dynamics of power sort of within these communities. But I think if we're thinking about if what came out was this fear of safety, I think I really want to look at crime maybe to see if that policy, if I were to sort of tackle that.
Or
Uh,
like how people
yeah,
voting related to crime issues versus
yeah,
prison. Yeah.
right. Like if middle and upper class Black people have these negative attitudes, um, how would that then translate into crime policies, right? Will we see more conservative leaning preferences on something like crime or like punitive punishment, right? For low income Black people versus things like welfare. And so I think that's where you might see more of a policy support gap,
Mhm.
where where middle and upper class Black people might show more conservative leaning policy preferences there due to the fear of safety, if my theory holds up. But again, there's so much work to be done. I'm still trying to figure all that out. But yeah, that's my next steps, I think.
So we have another question. I just want to try and get all that, because we've got great viewers who are being very
Oh,
active in the
please,
chat, which
yeah.
is great. So we have a question here from Rachel, who says, in your research, do you look at or factor in immigration status? So where a person may be from, if they're an immigrant or not, and how that may affect people's opinions within the Black community?
Yeah, that's a really great point, Rachel. I've thought about that a lot. Yeah, I'm first gen. My dad is Jamaican. My mom is Guyanese. And so I think that there's a different idea of sort of if we look at like work ethic and if we think about like ideas like sort of like individualism, right? How that plays out within first gen communities. I think I'll for sure see differences there. That is something that I put into the survey in my data. So I'll definitely analyze for that as well. I'm still working through my data, but that's something that I definitely want to control for and look at. But if I were to just speak from a hypothetical point, I think we would see differences there, more heightened views or more negative attitudes for folks that are immigrants.
There's another question from a viewer. Could safety be a concern as it relates to availability of healthcare, particularly in relationships to people's experiences during the recent COVID-19 pandemic?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I conducted this survey, I want to say 2, 3 months ago. And so while COVID-19 is very much so still a concern, I think it would be more of a concern, and please tell me if y'all feel the same way. I feel like it would be more of a concern, or it would be more something to be taken into consideration in the data at the height of it. But I think right now, while it is very much still something that impacts us, I didn't take that into consideration at first, but I'll definitely write that down. Thank you for that thought.
So I know you said that you were you've been doing this for about a year and a half. Is that right? That
Yeah.
you've been on this program or this project. What are some
Yeah.
places, like what are things, as much as you can tell us, and I don't know in the PhD world how much you can reveal ahead of time, but what are some areas of further study for you?
Yeah, so this is very much so, I'm really interested in class and Blackness. So this is where my work lies right now. But this is an ongoing project of what I want to do. And so, like I mentioned, some of the next steps include looking at an IAT, things like that, which we talked about. But overall, I'm trying to build this idea of sort of affluent Black consciousness, sort of, which has been studied before by sociologists. But that's the picture I'm trying to paint, right? That there's this affluent Black consciousness that is operating in ways that we might not know, that has very much so policy reactions to such. I also want to look at like respectability politics. I think that's really important.
Can you talk about that? Can you talk about?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so when I mention respectability, I think what I really mean with that is the idea that Black people have to be up to a certain standard, right? Like living up to the white gaze and to the ideals of sort of this like American dream. And so if we put that in relation to upper and middle class Black people, they are the idea of a respectable sort of minority, right? Like they have good paying jobs, they've worked their way up the ladder. And so I think about that then in relation to how they view members of their own in-group that might not have that same status, and what that does. And I think just generally, I want to shed light on low-income Black people being stigmatized, right? And that sort of stigmatization coming from sometimes members of their own group. And I think that's important to talk about, right? If we're really trying to talk about how class matters within these in-groups, these are things that we have to tackle.
So I have another question from Lemon Springs Girl, who's wondering do you have any ideas, or has your research shown anything about how mid to upper class white folks are viewing lower class white folks?
Yeah, that's a good question. My work, the sample that I have is of just Black folks. I think you can make an argument for that, right? That there is still that at play, that work ethic at play. Like, okay, maybe if they would have worked harder, they would have been able to do what I'm doing, have this good paying job. But honestly, I think that's just out of the scope of my research. I'm really interested in looking at intergroup dynamics within the Black community. But I think that's a great question. I think that there's literature on that within political science and sociology. None that I can think of right now, because I'm not so much in that realm. But no, my research doesn't give way to that, although that's a really great question.
Thank you. I really appreciate you just fielding all these questions. You're being a great sport. Thank you so much. We have another question from a viewer. Do you think that these same ideas about safety and fear existed during Jim Crow times when people lived in the same community, whether they were affluent or not?
That's a really interesting question. I wouldn't imagine it to operate in the same way. I think we see an economic progression of Blacks after Jim Crow. And once we hit the early 2000s, there's been an influx of Black people into the middle and upper class. And so I think when we see that dissonance happen, where there's some Black people that are moving into the middle and upper class, that are moving into a different class, but also moving into different areas, with low-income Black people being in their periphery now at this point, when they have interactions with other middle and like upper class Black people. I think that's when we start to see these attitudes really take form. Just with other contact with other people within their status, and as they move farther away maybe, or as they have more interactions with people within their own group, their class.
All right, thank you. All right, so I will say we've got about 15 minutes left, 10 to 12 minutes. So for people who are watching at home, again, if you haven't had a chance to actually ask your question, please do so. I will say Dr. Marsh did put a question in earlier when we were talking about the IAT test. I had asked you to describe it, and then I actually interrupted you, and I apologize.
No, that was great. Okay. You did a great job.
But could you tell us, like, what does the IAT stand for?
Implicit bias association test, I want to say. That's not something that I put into my work already. So it's something that I've just been thinking about. But from my understanding, please somebody correct me if I'm wrong, that's what it stands for. And it basically just tests like unconscious bias that people have towards certain groups.
Okay. So what do you think? I mean, and maybe it's too early. What are you feeling like as, you're picturing your project, you're picturing your research being done, we're 3 years down the road, we're all buying your book of all your research. What do you think the implications, or what are you anticipating or hoping maybe even some implications might be for this work?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think that it's really important to look at those class dynamics, right? And I think as a Black scholar, it's important to not problematize my role, but to truly look inward to see, are we somehow peddling a system and sort of doing this top-down concept that I talked about before. And so I think that this could really shed light into public sort of perceptions of low-income Black people. I'm hoping to look at policy ramifications, like I was talking about in the crime policy domain. And so if my hypothesis actually is confirmed within that, we would see policy shifts or like policy dissonances in support for middle and upper class Black people when looking at crime, right? And so I think that's really important if we were to look at districts where there's a sort of substantial number of Black people, and what that means for local laws, right? What that means for local policies. And so I think once we start looking at how class interacts with Blackness, and if we look at things like crime, and if we see sort of conservative leaning policy preferences there for middle and upper class Black people, I think then we can start to tackle that issue. And how do we go about that? How do we work to mitigate these negative attitudes? And I think the first step is to talk about it.
That's, I mean, and that goes back to the question we had earlier, like maybe getting is too strong of a word, but assisting people in recognizing their bias. And like one of the things that we do here in our office, and we've been doing, and actually in partnership with the library, we had a series for 4 years called The Elephant We Don't See Diversity Dialogue, which was really all about being able to identify a bias, because if you can't identify it, you can't work on it.
Exactly.
And I think for a lot of people, and I think you've touched about this, it can be very hard to say, I feel a bias. We often want to say we don't have any, when in fact they're very normal. Everybody has them. And as long as we can identify them, we can start to fix them. So it sounds like with your research, or where you're anticipating it going as it relates to maybe some more conservative policies as it relates to crime, if I understand that correctly, you may be anticipating that might be an outcome. If your research does link those policy beliefs with also a racialized belief about low-income Black people, and readers see themselves reflected in that they may then have a shift in their crime policies. Is that a
Yes,
fair kind of summary of what
exactly.
you think is
That was
happening?
great. Yeah, no, yeah. I think it's really easy within folks that are marginalized to sort of think, oh, those are not ideas that we have, right? We don't, um, those are tropes that we just don't believe in. That's really easy for us to say. It's a harder conversation to say racism is super powerful and it impacts even those that it marginalizes.
Mm-hmm.
And so part of my argument is that this is not our fault, but it's now our sort of responsibility to have this conversation, and to think about ways that we can help out our whole group, right?
I love that. This is not our fault, but
Yeah,
now we have this responsibility. We have two.
exactly.
We have two more questions from viewers as of right now, so let me bring those in. And then I will just say I'm going to put Amber's email also into the chat in just a moment and put up on the screen as well. So people are also able to contact Amber if they want to after this conversation. So Melissa Holland says, how have the prejudices of white folks influenced the way Blacks or different socioeconomic classes perceive each other? And I think that's probably the foundation of your research. Want to go over that a little bit?
Yeah, no, thank you guys. That's like such a great question because I can't say this enough. I think this all comes from the white gaze, GAZE. I don't think that Black people, that middle and upper class Black people, are doing this alone. This doesn't happen in a vacuum. I think that these ideas are very much so ideas that have been internalized with time. Um, yeah, yeah. So I think A happens with B, right?
Thank you. So I was putting your email. I was putting your email into the chat, so it's just going to pop up right now for people.
Perfect. Thank
Um,
you.
and then let me just get this. I'll just put this on the screen. If anybody wants to write that down, it's ACOLQUHO, ACOLQUHO at umd.edu. And Amber invited us to share her email with viewers. So you have it. And we have another question here. You spoke a little about this already, but will your study also consider national origin within Black and survey and the survey answers?
Yeah, I did have a question in my survey asking folks' national origin, and if they weren't born in the States, to list the state that they're from or the country that they're from. And so that's definitely something that I want to take into consideration. I think that if we were to look at folks that weren't born here, I think that immigrants might have the tendency to endorse these negative attitudes at a more salient rate, at a higher rate. And so that's something that I'm definitely interested in looking at from a quantitative background and not just thinking about it and theorizing.
How have people received your work so far?
That's a great question. That's a really great question. I think outside of the academic realm, when I talk to other Black people, I think it's needed work and it's received as such, especially, going back home. I think I'm doing work for my community to help them, to shed light on how they're perceived, and to break some of those ideas, right? I think within academia, I think it's for right now, I've gotten a lot of support. Thank God to winning a lot of scholarships on my work. So it seems like it's being perceived well. I haven't published anything yet, so I think that's really the test. I just think it's really important to ground this in this is a top-down thing, right? This is not something that middle and upper class Black people are doing by themselves. It is not their fault. And so I think framing it within that is really important.
This is great. We are almost at time, so let me just close by asking you: do you have anything that you'd like to share that you haven't had the opportunity to talk about yet?
I just really wanted to say thank you guys so much for the questions. I'm very much so here. If anybody has any questions, if anybody wants to talk more about research more generally or about their interests, I'll be happy to do so, or even hear more of your thoughts on my work. And it was just great being here.
Well, it's been wonderful to have you. Thank you so much for being our first guest in this series. We are very excited about social Yeah, it's going to be, it is really going to be, it is already, and it's going to be, and I'm so sorry about my light. I'm trying to deal with the
No,
sun.
you're okay.
Sorry.
Don't apologize.
So we really, really appreciate you being here, being with us and sharing. I definitely want to be, genuinely want to be kept in touch with what you're doing. If you have a paper come out or there's something that we can look at, please send it our way. We definitely want to hear more about it. And for people at home, we are continuing this series. It is every Thursday from 2 to 3 now till the first week of May, with the exception of February 29th when we're not doing it. But every other week now, until the beginning of May, we will be meeting with different scholars from the University of Maryland, talking about just amazing research of what's going on in academia and in our communities, as we heard from Amber today. So I really want to thank Amber. Thank you so much for being with us. Thank you to Dr. Marsh, as I said, for this whole series and the gift of her leadership in our communities in many different ways. To the library system for partnering, the University of Maryland for partnering, and for all of you for tuning in and bringing your excellent questions for us tonight. It has just been fantastic. Or today, I'm used to doing evening programs. Thank you so much for being with us. And Amber, we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you guys so much.
Okay. Bye.